Hi, today we're going to be taking a look at the RTX 3060 in 2023 and one game from 2022 for some reason. We're going to be pairing it with 32GB of 3600MHz CL16 RAM and having a look at it with both the 5600X and the 5800X 3D to test whether it's worth going with this higher end CPU when using this lower mid-range GPU. Now there is going to be quite a lot of settings which are basically within margin of error or just exactly the same here, but I thought I'd leave them in so that people can see them anyway, and just so that people can see how the 3060 performs at all the settings in these newer games for anyone considering an RTX 3060 in 2023. Now you might find some of the settings I use here strange, but I didn't include any settings what at least one of the CPUs wasn't able to lock 30 FPS on, and 60 FPS in multiplayer games. So you'll notice that I go straight to DLSS or FSR at certain settings, just to stay within that rule kind of thing. And also you'll notice that I didn't go down to like the very bottom settings, unless the game was really demanding and I thought it required it to get a good FPS. Because even though it would show bigger gaps between the CPUs, I wanted to keep it like more real world settings what people might actually use while gaming. For most of the games I've included the little run that I did as the first part of the intro, and then we'll fade just into general gameplay after that. There is a couple of exceptions to this in games where I've used the built-in benchmark, so I've just included gameplay there, and in Plague Tale, but I'll explain that later. One last thing, I'm just on Windows 10 Home and rebar was enabled, and I used MSI Afterburner to take all my data, even in the ones where I used an inbuilt benchmark, just to keep things the same. But anyway, I think that's pretty much all the explaining that I have to do for myself. So let's get into the video. Let's do it. Right, so we're going to start out with Battlefield 2042. I used a bot match for this so that I didn't get killed 5,000 times, so I only got about 3,000 deaths here, so it wasn't too long. With this game being multiplayer, I used a little bit more DLSS than I normally would in a single player game. I didn't go right down to the bottom because I feel like, well, you want to be able to actually still see the enemies, so you don't want to go too low res. But for those of you who want the extra frame rate, I thought it was worth going just a little bit more. Right, so starting out with 4K, and we see we can get a lock 60 at some, well, pretty low settings, but it's not too bad. But adding extra DLSS isn't really giving you much extra in the averages. Looking like we're CPU limited straight away, but it does give the 5800X 3D a little advantage in the 1% lows to go along with its better minimums. So now we're going to move down to 1440p, and we're starting at high settings and then DLSS balance and DLSS performance. And we're pretty much within margin of error in the averages here, but the X3D is much better in the 1% lows, being 18% better with DLSS performance and 9% without DLSS. Now we turn down to low settings. You see a similar story, the averages being pretty much within margin of error, both CPUs hitting a wall here in the averages with DLSS performance, the X3D being up to 22% faster in the 1% lows, and around 10% smoother without any DLSS. So now we have 1080p high settings, and both systems are pretty much neck and neck, apart from once again in the 1% lows, where the X3D was up to 18% better. The 3060 giving you a nice locked 90 there at any setting, and actually with the 5600X I was able to get a locked 120, but like I say, it's margin of error, and in this game it is liable to drop below that, depending on how many people are shooting you in the face at once. Now we move down to low settings to try and maximise our FPS here, and both systems easily able to hit a locked 120 now. I've seen the 5600X kind of beating it a bit in the first two settings, but by a tiny little bit. Once you get frame rates this high, kind of 4 frames is pretty much still within margin of error, I'd say. But the 1% lows of the 5800X 3D still being 13% better there. But yeah, as you can see, there's no huge difference between the averages or minimums of either of the CPUs with the 3060 here. But there is some nice gains to smoothness with the X3D, providing consistently better 1% lows. The 3060 does pretty well here with either CPU, being able to provide a good enough frame rate for most people, while still maintaining good image quality. Right, so now we move on to The Last of Us, and I picked this little area because it's really harsh on the CPU, but also enough going on to run your GPU pretty hard at the same time. This is probably the game that I would consider to be the most affected by CPU out of anything I've played anyway. It looks great but runs like shite. Right, so starting with 4K, and we were able to lock 30 with a couple of settings here, so we'll spend a bit more time at 4K than we did in the last game. And if you are happy with 30 FPS, the 3060 is doing pretty good here, I'd say, with its extra VRAM, allowing it to lock 30 with ultra settings and DLSS balanced. Neither CPU is making a big difference to the performance here though, as you're completely GPU limited. Turning down to high settings, we're now able to lock 30 with DLSS quality, and it's a little bit safer 30, I'd say, locking at 33 there. You'll get a little bit smoother if you turn down to DLSS performance too. There's a very slight boost to the 1% lows for the 5800X 3D here, but it's so close I doubt you'd notice. And it could just be margin of error, although it is consistent up to this point. Turning down the settings to medium, we're a little bit smoother now. I'd say the game will feel a little bit better with DLSS quality there. And then with performance, it's going to feel pretty good, but you might notice the image degradation, so it might not be for you. The 1% lows are pulling away a little bit now with the 5800X 3D, beating the 5600X by 11% with DLSS quality and 19% with DLSS performance. Straight into 1440p now, and the 3060 is scraping a lock 60 with the X3D, and it's pretty close with the 5600X2. There's some real big differences between the 1% lows now. The X3D being 33% better with DLSS balanced, and 24% better with DLSS quality. Now we're going to turn down to high settings, and with DLSS balanced here, the X3D was able to lock 60 quite comfortably as well, whereas the 5600X was really close but didn't get me there. Which brings me to a pretty annoying issue I had in this game, which prevented me from including medium settings in this, because you can lock 60 with the 5600X at medium, but I was having really bad stutters, so my 0.1% lows were terrible with both CPUs. And actually, I've just turned down to 1080p Ultra there, and I had the exact same issue with all my 1080p settings as well. You might be able to alleviate this by picking a setting that you can lock 60 at and actually locking it, but I'm not sure. Once again here, you've seen the X3D managing to lock 60 where the 5600X is struggling, and there's a massive 44% gap in the 1% lows there. Turning down to high settings, which again caused me massive stutters, but as you'll see anyway, the 5800X 3D able to lock 60, well at least 60 at both settings, while the 5600X just can't quite make it. And there's a huge 30% gap in the 1% lows in the X3D's favour, although both did have terrible 0.1% lows due to stutters. So yeah, as you can see, you are better off with the X3D in this game, quite a bit actually. The 5600X struggling to lock 60, at least at any settings that weren't just completely stuttery. But it's not really the fault of the 5600X here. This game just runs like absolute crap, honestly. And like I say, the issues with the stutters may be able to be solved by putting a 60 FPS lock in. Then you might actually be fine with the 5600X at 1440p medium. But I haven't actually had a chance to test this myself. And either way, the 5800X 3D still absolutely destroys it in the 1% lows. Now we have Fortnite, and as with the other multiplayer titles, we're going to use a little bit more DLSS than we normally would here, just to try and get them really high frame rates. This game can really take it as well. I think it's pretty stylised, so you can get away with it a bit more than the average game. And the game's so colourful that the visibility remains okay. I ran the game in DX12 mode here, so Lumen and Nanite are enabled at high settings, but it's turned off automatically at medium and low. Also, at medium and low, I won't be using any DLSS because it already has quite a lot of upscaling on, so you're just replacing that upscaling with other upscaling, so the numbers you get aren't really much different. High even has a little bit of upscaling on itself, but DLSS does seem to make a lot of difference there. I use the in-bit replay function here, so it should be really accurate, and you can see my little run on the screen at the moment. Right, so we're going to start off with 4K medium and low because we weren't able to get any reasonable settings at high. I mean, if you want to lock 30 you can, but it's not really ideal playing Fortnite at 30 really. As you can see, both CPUs are pretty much neck and neck at medium settings, but when you go down to low settings, you are getting a 16% boost to the 1% lows with the 5600X3D. Now we're going to go down to 1440p. We're starting with high settings with DLSS balanced and DLSS performance. And as you can see, we're pretty much neck and neck here. The X3D is winning in the 1% lows very slightly, but I don't think it's anything you'd notice in gameplay. The 3060 providing a nice lock 60 experience there, without too much DLSS for those of you who still want a reasonable frame rate to play the game at, but still want to be able to enjoy the extra graphics features. Now I move down to 1440p medium and low. Now we're getting some ridiculous frame rates with both CPUs. The X3D allowing you to lock 244Hz there for anyone who has a 244Hz monitor, and the gaps are pretty massive even in the averages now. Whether you'll notice a difference between 385 and 321 though, I'm not sure. The X3D does have 91% better 1% lows though. Now we're going down to 1080p high settings, and as you can see there's not much of a difference between any setting. I mean, even the 5600X is winning sometimes there, but we're pretty much within margin of error. There's still a slight boost for the X3D in the 1% lows, but nothing really major. So now we're going to finish off with 1080p medium and low. The gaps weren't quite as big as 1440p here, but there's still a 31% lead for the 5800X3D in the 1% lows, and the added benefit of being able to lock a 240Hz monitor. I doubt there is a massive amount of people running a 3060 and such a high refresh rate monitor though, but I'm sure there's some. Do you exist? There's also a nice boost to the averages, but I'm not sure if it's anything you'd be able to feel at such high frame rates. And I did actually feel stuttering with both CPUs in this one at any setting, as the game just tends to enjoy a stutter now and then. But yeah, as you can see, the 3060 performs pretty good with either of these CPUs in this game, especially if you're after really high frame rates for competitive play and aren't too interested in all the UE5 bells and whistles. At these settings you are getting a nice boost to the averages with the X3D and much better percentile lows. Especially at 1440p low there, you are getting a much smoother experience. 90% better is pretty big, but it is a lot closer at all the other high frame rate settings, and whether you'll be able to feel that depends on the person really, as they're both pretty high. And if you are someone who'd rather just lock 60 and have a little bit of lumen and nanite on, then you won't find much difference between the CPU at these settings. Next up we have Remnant 2, another UE5 title here. And the area I chose here, that little bit where I just shook the camera there, that's actually the hardest area I found to run in the game. When you're out fighting outside, it's actually a little bit easier and doesn't drop quite as low as there. And it is a really hard game to run this one, so I've used more DLSS than I normally would to try and get close to that lock 60 or hit a lock 60. And it might just be my eyesight, but I actually think for some reason it doesn't look as bad upscaled from such a low resolution as some other games do. So starting with 4K medium settings and a lot of DLSS, we're doing alright here, managing to lock 30 and a reasonable like 60 average there with the X3D with DLSS Ultra performance, although it might be a little too much DLSS for you. The CPUs themselves are pretty evenly matched here. The X3D slightly ahead, but it's really close, so it could just be margin of error. So we're moving down to low settings now, and we're able to lock 30 with a little bit less DLSS, so it might be more preferable for you, but it does look quite a bit better at medium. Once again, there's a very slight lead for the X3D in nearly every metric, so it might not be margin of error, but it's close enough to be. So now we move down to 1440p, and we're still struggling to lock 60 here, even with DLSS performance. For whatever reason at 1440p the CPUs are even closer than they were at 4K, the 5600X even getting a little tiny victory in some areas, even in the area that the X3D is famed for, the 1% lows. But realistically, it's within margin of error again. So now we're going to turn down to 1440 low, and we're finally able to lock 60 FPS with the 3060 here. And possibly during fighting scenes you might be able to lock 60 FPS with DLSS balanced. As like I said earlier, the bit that I took my run from is harder to run than the fighting, at least any areas that I've been to. Not much to say about the differences between the CPUs again, no noticeable benefit with the X3D. So now we're going to go down to 1080p high settings, which is a bit more suited to the 3060, at least in this game anyway. But you still need the use of one more level of DLSS than I'd normally use to get a lock 60 there. And I was able to get a lock 60 with the X3D where I wasn't with the 5600X, but it is only scraping 60. The 5800X3D is beating the 5600X at all settings here, but it's nothing you're going to notice in gameplay. Turning down to low settings now. I left medium out because there's not much of a difference between high and medium. You still can't get a lock 60 without DLSS balanced. And we're able to lock 60 with a much more reasonable DLSS quality, although the game does look noticeably worse at low. At these settings it does seem that the X3D starts to pull away a little bit more as there's a bit more load on the CPU, but it's nothing major. So yeah, as you can see with this one, the 3060 does struggle with it a little bit, as it's very hard to run. And really you're probably going to want DLSS balance to get a lock 60, even at 1080p. Unless you're happy to turn down to low settings where you can then use DLSS quality, but low settings do remove a lot of the graphical effects. CPU wise, well, I'd pretty much say they're within margin of error. There's sometimes at the very low 1080p low settings there where possibly a tiny little boost for the X3D, but like I've said a couple of times in this video, it is within margin of error. Right, so now we have Resident Evil 4, and my run doesn't start till I jump out the window here, but I thought it looked kind of cool just to go from the doorway to the doorway there. So yeah, once we actually do manage to jump out the window, I chose this bit here with the Chainsaw Man because this is one of the hardest areas in the game to run. And on the harder difficulty, there's a few more baddies running around, so it's a little bit more stress on the CPU. Although it does make benchmarking it absolute torture. But I want to use this as I think it's most important to keep your frame rate high here. I chose the settings that I've used just to keep things simple. I left out max because it always puts the textures to red, which can cause issues, but you can easily turn down the textures just a little bit, but it's just a bit complicated for the video. Also works the other way as well. You could choose the ray tracing preset and put the textures up and really not have any effect on your frame rate there, as long as you stay below the VRAM limits, which is pretty easy with the 3060. Right, so we're going to start with 4K, the ray tracing preset here, with FSR quality balanced and performance to keep that lock 30. And as you can see, the CPUs are trading blows in all metrics, as you're completely GPU limited here. FSR doesn't look great in this game in my opinion, so personally I wouldn't be going below FSR balanced at 4K here, and especially if you're using a controller, it'll feel okay. So we're going to go to the balance preset next, because prioritised graphics, there's not really any difference between ray tracing, barely anyway. We're still unable to lock 30 without FSR, so there won't be any settings without that at 4K. And the CPUs are pretty close once again, but surprisingly the 5600X is actually beating the X3D in 1% lows and minimums overall at this setting. But as seems to be the slogan of this video, it's within margin of error. Now we're going down to 1440p ray tracing preset, and both CPUs are able to lock 60 now. And the X3D does show a little boost to the 1% lows when using FSR balanced, but it's pretty evenly matched to the other settings. And personally, I wouldn't go to FSR balanced at 1440p here because this game just doesn't like it. So we're going to move down to 1440p balance now. And as you can see, when adding FSR, the little extra load on the CPU there is allowing the X3D to pull away in the lows again and the minimums, but the 5600X did actually best it without DLSS or FSR even. But if you don't mind the added fizzle here of FSR balanced, the X3D was 17% smoother in the 1% lows. Now we're going to go down to 1080p ray tracing preset, and as you can see this game is quite hard on the CPU, and you are getting a nice boost here with the 5800X3D, having a 12% boost to the averages, a 23% boost to the 1% lows, and a 17% boost to the minimums with FSR quality on there. But due to the image quality of FSR in this game, I'd probably stick to the more evenly matched ray tracing preset with no FSR. or turn down the prioritised graphics setting. And for whatever reason, we'll see at 1080p it does actually make a big difference at this resolution. We are still really evenly matched with no FSR, but with FSR quality we're getting a little boost to the averages, 12% better minimums, and 18% smoother 1% lows, allowing the X3D to lock 90 FPS there. Moving down to the balance preset now, and there's more loads added to the CPUs. You see the X3D increases its lead, even with no FSR here, with a small boost to the averages and 15% better 1% lows and minimums. And with FSR enabled we're getting 13% better averages, 22% better 1% lows and 13% better minimums. So in Resident Evil it's only really if you're trying to lock 90 at 1080p that you're going to notice much difference between the CPUs. There is a small boost to the 1% lows at 1440p with FSR balanced, if you don't mind the added fizzle that adds to the image using that in this game. But if you're someone like me who doesn't really like the look of FSR in this game, or someone who's happy with a lock 60, either CPU will provide you pretty much identical performance at any of these settings. So up next is Returnal, and in this one I use the inbuilt benchmark just to keep the runs as uniform as possible, as it's really impossible to keep an action-packed run and have it the same every time, as the world around you is randomly generated. So it's just a little bit of gameplay and no actual run. There's quite a lot of settings here, as I decided to put a few ray tracing ones in, and like the other single player games there's also some locked 30 settings, but myself I probably wouldn't play this game with less than 60 FPS, but that's up to you. So we start out with 4K low, and really myself the only setting that I would consider playing it here is with DLSS performance. CPU wise I'd say they're pretty evenly matched. It does look like when you add DLSS performance that the 1% lows get bit better in the X3D, but could be a bit of a fluke because the 5600X is matching it at every other setting there, and it's nothing to write home about really. So now we're going to go down to 1440p medium settings, and as you can see both CPUs are trading blows at all settings, and the 3060 is able to lock 60 FPS with either CPU now. It's pretty well optimised this game, it's pretty good at putting most of the load on your GPU, even though it is still quite a difficult game to run. Now we go down to low settings, and I was able to lock 60 here with the 3060 with DLSS quality just, and once again the CPUs are trading blows, back and forth within margin of error of each other depending on the setting. Keeping the same settings now but adding a bit of ray tracing at the medium quality setting. This was the highest setting I was able to go and lock 30 with ray tracing on, and no DLSS and still get a lock 30. Also there's no point going to the low settings in ray tracing because it doesn't really benefit you frame rate wise, and it's kind of pointless it being on really. As you can see we can nearly get a lock 60 with DLSS balanced, and to repeat my favourite saying of the video, the CPUs are within margin of error. Surprisingly in this game, even with ray tracing on, it doesn't split the two CPUs apart, which makes me wonder why it does in pretty much every other new game. Anyway, down to 1080p now, and we're finally able to get a nice lock 60 at high settings with DLSS quality, while keeping the image quality looking pretty good. Once again there's nothing between the CPUs. Now we're going to move down to 1080p medium settings, and I was able to scrape a lock 60 here with both CPUs with no DLSS enabled, so if you don't like DLSS this might be the setting for you, although it is pretty close to dropping off that 60 there. Once again the CPUs are neck and neck, still see no benefit in the 1% lows from the X3D here, which is normally what it would be known for. Adding a bit of RT at medium settings to the medium settings now. There's no change in the CPU performance even with RT here, and you're able to get a nice lock 60 here with a bit of DLSS quality with either CPU with the 3060. Turning RT off now and moving down to the low settings. And as you can see, even at low settings, there's no benefit from the 5800X3D in this game. And I was able to lock 60 FPS with the 3060 pretty comfortably with either CPU. Finally, we're going to add medium RT to the low settings, which is kind of pointless really looking at the frame rates. You might as well just stay with the medium settings there. Gives you a few FPS, but realistically it's probably not worth it for the degradation to image quality. And once again, there's no benefit from going with a 5800X 3D in this game, even at the lowest of the low setting with RT. So yeah, I can't find any benefit to go with a 5800X 3D in this game. You're pretty much neck and neck no matter what setting you choose or what resolution. 3060 itself is able to provide some alright frame rates and some pretty good image quality settings, and even a bit of ray tracing if you want it, so definitely still a very playable, good looking experience. So now we have Jedi Survivor, the legendary CPU destroyer itself. Its only rival is The Last of Us Part 1. Has improved a bit since launch, but it's still quite hard on your CPU, and pretty ridiculous with ray tracing turned on, to be honest. And I do wonder why, because after taking a look at Returnal there, which lets the CPU scale fine with ray tracing on, you wonder what's going on in this game really. This is my little run on the screen. Well, it's quite a long run compared to the other ones. Has a bit of everything really, and later in the run you'll see like there's a fluorescent light, which when you go near it just destroys your frame rate, which most of the time will be when I hit the minimums, but not all the time, due to stutters, etc. Starting out with 4K, and we're using medium settings with FSR performance plus low settings with FSR performance and low settings with ray tracing and FSR performance. These are the highest settings I was able to get a lock 30 with in this game, and as you can see the CPUs are neck and neck here, a couple of frames here and there depending on the setting. It is nice to see that the 3060 is capable of getting a lock 30 at 4K though, even with ray tracing enabled. Going down to 1440p high settings, and we're starting with FSR quality and FSR balanced as I couldn't lock 30 without. And we're getting some pretty good averages, which actually felt fine to me when playing with a controller. It's not a lock 60, but with FSR balanced it pretty much lingers around there most of the time. As for the CPUs, they're too close to consider them anything but within margin of error. Staying at high settings now but turning on ray tracing. And once again, we're not really seeing any difference between the CPUs here. Well, not any difference worth mentioning really. You're not getting a smooth experience as you were without ray tracing on, but you're doing a lot better than you were at 4K, and it is still playable with a controller. Here comes the fluorescent light of doom. Turning RT off now and going down to low settings, and once again there's no real difference between the CPUs here, and we're still unable to lock 60 FPS with the 3060, although we are really close and will remain there most of the time really, other than the occasional dip. Turning on ray tracing at low settings, we see the X3D doing slightly better in the averages and 1% lows. The minimums are pretty much exactly the same. Realistically though, they are really close, so I wouldn't worry about either CPU here. I didn't include FSR balanced as you don't gain anything, it just matches the quality settings pretty much. Well, I did actually gain some extra stutters. So anyway, now we're going to move down to 1080p. We've got high settings and FSR quality, and with FSR quality you're finally able to lock 60 now with both CPUs. You're getting slightly better averages with the X3D, but it's only 7%, and it's pretty much trading blows at every other metric. So now we're adding ray tracing in the high settings here, and we're still unable to lock 60 with either CPU. But with FSR quality on, the 5800X 3D is 17% better on average, and the 1% lows are a massive 41% better, and the minimums were 11% higher. Right, so turning off RT and moving down to medium settings now. We're going to skip low because you still need FSR quality to lock 60, so might as well just go with medium. And as you can see, without FSR you're pretty much neck and neck, with a 10% gain in the averages with FSR and very slightly better 1% lows. Turning RT on now at medium, and we're getting pretty similar performance with no FSR here, but we are getting some pretty good gains with the X3D with FSR quality enabled. being 13% faster on average, with 47% better 1% lows and 11% better minimums. We're still unable to get a lock 60 with RTE though, and just in case you were wondering, it's not possible to get that at RT low either. So yeah, in this game, even though it's a bit of a CPU destroyer, it does seem that unless you want to use RT at 1080p with FSR quality, there's really no reason to go with the 58X3D over the 5600X. There is a little bit of performance to be gained at 1080p medium settings and also 1080 low, and there's actually even more performance to be gained if you're using even more FSR than I am in this video, but I wouldn't really advise doing that in this game if you don't have to, as the image quality will really suffer. And this is just my opinion, but myself, I'd just pick a setting without ray tracing where you can lock 60 and just go with that, as ray tracing does actually increase the stutters a little bit, well, in my experience anyway. Right, so now we have a Plague Tale, which obviously isn't from 2023, but it's got really good graphics, and it's pretty hard to run, and you will find it heavy on the CPU at times, especially in the areas with rats. Now, this isn't actually the area that I recorded my data from, but it was an area very similar to this with rats and a torch, etc. My Xbox Game Pass subscription ended, and I'd forgot to record the video of me doing the run. Because I'm a bit of a peasant, I decided I didn't really want to spend the extra money just to install a game, record one 1.5 minute video, and then uninstall the game. So we have this video instead, which I recorded on a higher end graphics card, so it probably has a bit better image quality than I'd have been able to achieve with the 3060. At least at 60 FPS anyway. Right, so we're going to start 4K medium settings with DLSS quality, DLSS balance and DLSS performance. And as you can see, we're able to get some okay frame rates here, definitely playable for this style of game in my opinion. Both CPUs are pretty much neck and neck here. There's a tiny boost to the 1% lows with DLSS performance, but it's pretty much within margin of error.
I think we can climb that wall, but I'll need my hands free.
Now we turn down to low settings with DLSS quality, balanced and performance, and we're pretty much neck and neck with both the CPUs. Although it does look like there's a slight boost to the 1% lows with the 5800X3D. I was able to get close to an average 60 FPS here, but not quite. Now we're going to go down to 1440p, but we're going to have ultra settings, and then DLSS quality and DLSS balanced. And we're able to lock 60 FPS here with DLSS balanced, giving you a nice combination of FPS and frame rate there. At this setting we did see the X3D pull away slightly in the 1% lows, but there's no difference between the two CPUs at the other settings. So now we're going to go down to the medium settings, and here we actually see the 5600X looking slightly better at every setting, at every metric, but it is very slightly, and definitely within margin of error, just for a change. As are the other settings really, where the X3D was taking over. Getting close to the end of the video now. I'm starting to lose my voice a bit now, so I'm starting to sound a bit, oh yeah, Macho Man Randy Savage. But anyway, we're going to go down to 1080p now. And at ultra settings we see both CPUs within margin of error. It did look like when I was going through the 4K data area that 5800X3D was going to consistently destroy the 5600X3D in the 1% lows, and although it does look like it does beat it, it's not by an amount that's really going to matter. So now we're going to go down to 1080p medium settings, and you can probably guess what I'm going to say about the CPUs here. In fact, I'll just let you fill in the blanks. Yeah, you're right, it is. But anyway, the 3060 is doing pretty good here, able to knock 90 with both CPUs, or 60 with no DLSS. The 3060 does pretty good in this game, able to lock 60 at 1440p ultra settings with a bit of DLSS, and at 1080p without even using any DLSS at all, and even a 90 lock if you're willing to go down low enough in settings and DLSS. CPU wise, I'd say it really doesn't matter which CPU you have in this game. The 5800X3D does seem to perform a little bit better in the 1% lows, but it's about 7% at best, and lower than that most of the time. And when it comes to 1% laws, I don't really consider anything under 10% to really matter, as there are a lot more all over the place than just general frame rate. Right, so this is our final game, and I kept this to last for a reason. I'll pretty much sum it up for you now. Margin of error. It's actually really surprising how close the CPUs were in this game. I used the built-in benchmark to get my numbers, and it must just have ran exactly the same every time, or pretty much anyway. As the CPUs run so close in this game with this GPU that when I was looking through the data, I was starting to wonder if I just copied and pasted the same thing into two separate notepads, but there is some very small differences here and there. But if you are someone that's interested in this for the CPU differences, you might want to just skip this game and only bother looking through if you're someone who wants to know the 3060 runs in this game. One thing I do want to mention though is that in Warzone there might be a lot of difference between the CPUs, unlike the multiplayer mode here. But it's a huge undertaking testing Warzone for this type of video, so I've had to give it a miss unfortunately. I may do a separate video for that though. Being a multiplayer, I only went with settings where you could lock 60 here. So you've got basic with DLSS performance, DLSS ultra performance and minimum settings. Just like I mentioned earlier, there's no difference between the CPUs here. But the 3060 is capable of some playable frame rates, even at 4K. But now we're going to go down to 1440p to hopefully find a bit more competitive settings. Once again, you don't see any difference with the CPUs here. We're at 1440p balanced settings with DLSS quality, with DLSS balanced and performance. And with DLSS performance we can comfortably lock 90 there, giving a pretty good competitive frame rate. I normally wouldn't use DLSS performance at 1440p, but being a multiplayer game, get a few extra frames, it might be worth it to you. But now we're turning down to basic settings with the same levels of DLSS. Once again we're playing spot the difference between the CPUs and performance there. 3060 is able to lock 90 there with DLSS balanced, and even a pretty comfortable 100 FPS with DLSS performance. Now we have 1440p minimum settings, and both CPUs are doing great here. The minimums weren't quite as good with the 5600X, but there's a chance the X3D could drop that low as well. Now we're going down to 1080p, we're starting with ultra settings and we have no DLSS on the first setting, just to show you that you're still unable to lock that 60 FPS there. But we were able to lock it with DLSS quality with both CPUs, both being pretty much neck and neck. The 5600X winning in some areas here and there, and the same for the X3D there. Going down to 1080p balance now, and it's back to margin of error. You are able to get some nice frame rates with the 3060 here, but not quite locking 120 FPS. Now we're going to go down to basic settings. We're finally able to lock 120 now with both CPUs, giving us a really good multiplayer experience with the 3060, although maybe a little bit of a blurry one. Finally, we're going to go to 1080p minimum settings, and I wasn't going to include this because you can't really see anyone in the game, so it's not really very good, but the frame rates are really high, and once again, it's pretty much evenly matched between the CPUs. So yeah, in Modern Warfare 2, there's literally no difference between the CPUs at any setting when using the 3060, but the 3060 is still a good GPU for this game. Able to get you a nice locked 90, 100, even 120 FPS, although probably a bit blurry for what you'd really want for spotting people from a distance. But it definitely offers a playable experience at reasonable visual quality levels, and if you are interested in Warzone and how the CPUs perform with the RTX 3060 in that game, comment below and I'll try and get around to making a video on pretty much any other popular free game as well. So, as you can see, the 3060 is still a pretty good card for 2023, and it has the rare bonus of having a reasonable amount of VRAM, so it allows you to turn up the textures at lower settings to get better image quality without really affecting the performance, and will occasionally allow you higher textures than certain other higher end GPUs, even if the overall settings may have to be a bit lower. It's mainly suited for 1080p these days, at least in these games, but if you don't mind using DLSS balanced or performance quite a bit, and being mainly at 30 FPS or slightly above in single player games, it gives a passable experience in the newest titles even at 4K. With some upscaling, it can handle 1440p at 60 FPS in most games too, and even in games I'd consider to be broken messes, Last of Us, it gets 60 FPS at 1080p pretty confidently, and a lot of frames above that too in most games. Keep in mind these are some of the most demanding games available, so going by games in general, the 3060 will do a lot better in most titles than it does in these big 2023 single player games, so the video kind of paints it in its worst light really. One thing I will say though, is if all the new Unreal Engine 5 titles are going to be as demanding as Remnant, the 3060 might start to struggle pretty quickly if you're looking for a 60 FPS experience, but there's no way of knowing that now, so who knows, that could just be badly optimised or whatever, and hopefully the engine will perform a little bit better over time. Now for the CPUs, and the one thing that surprised me is the 1% laws. From what you hear about the 5800X3D, it's the master of percentile laws, and it'll give you a much smoother gaming experience even when providing similar averages. But it seems that isn't always the case. When the CPU isn't really doing much, you don't really see much of a difference in that area at all. Obviously there are some cases where you do see some nice gains in the 1% laws, and even some games where they're better at pretty much every setting, but as you can see it's not guaranteed, and depending on the game, the CPUs can perform pretty much exactly the same at every setting sometimes, and not just in the 1% laws. But there is some games like Last of Us where having the 5800X3D just lets you get that lock 60 if that's really important to you. But are those few extra frames really worth that much more money? I don't know. It's really hard to say whether the 5800X3D is worth it with the 3060 for someone else. This is just a small selection of games, and it really does depend on what games you play, and how much you value those few extra frames, or smoother laws in certain games, and actually whether you'd notice the difference in the laws yourself. If you exclusively play Battlefield, Last of Us and Fortnite at 1440p low settings, then it might be worth it for you, or there might be another game that you like that really benefits from the upgrade, and you feel it's worth the extra money. But if I was making the decision myself, personally, I'd go with the 5600X. The 5800X3D is better. It's just at this price range, I'd say playing nearly double for your CPU to get a 20% extra gains in the 1% laws, etc. isn't really worth it, when you could take the extra cash and put it towards a more powerful graphics card and get better FPS overall. But everyone's different, and I'm really just providing the data to hopefully help you decide whether it's worth it for you. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching the video, hope it helps, hope you enjoyed it, hope it provided you with some value. If you did like the video, please give it a like and subscribe for more. Thanks, bye.